All right. Sorry about that, guys. Sorry. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to hand it over to Jade, who is going to host today's episode. And she's going to introduce our lovely speaker as well. All right, Jade.
Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the RiSWP Mentorship Series. It's nice to see some familiar names and then new names as well. We want to make this super open and very interactive. So please feel free to turn your video cameras on, post who you are in the chat and where you're from. We always like to see that. And welcome. So a little bit of what the mentor program is about. We do these like a series of videos once every 2 months or so, and we get great professionals working with data in the smart water industry from all over the world, and then we record these videos and then we post it on YouTube on our RiSWP YouTube channel. So even if people miss this, if you're interested in this and you find it interesting and then you want to go back and look at past interviews, totally feel free to check out our YouTube channel. I sometimes go back and listen to those because they're really interesting, especially if I'm looking for some career advice in the moment. So I have a set of questions with me already, but we're definitely going to be diving in with questions from the audience as well. So, right, with that, I'd like to introduce our mentor for the episode. So Dr. Veena Srinivasan is a water expert with 20 years of experience working with water management in India. She is a senior fellow at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, where she leads the Center of Social and Environmental Innovation. As a water researcher, Veena's work has always been interdisciplinary. Her focus has been on solutions that are backed by science, but designed for people facing the Indian water crisis. So at CSCI, she is leading the mission to transform scientific research into real-world impact by designing solutions that simultaneously create livelihoods and conserve the environment. Veena received her PhD from Stanford University and is an alumnus of Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. Dr. Srinivasan also co-hosts a podcast that I've been listening to recently called the Water Data Podcast, which I recommend to everyone, where they delve into different aspects of water data for water management. Interestingly, from a RiSWP perspective, she's also overseen work to develop a citizens dashboard for lakes in Bangalore, a city in India, where they synthesize data from low-cost sensors and data collected by citizen scientists to help manage lakes better. So Dr. Srinivasan or Veena, welcome to our chat.
Thank you so much, Jade, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak to young people like yourself, and really excited about what you guys have put together.
Great, we're excited too. So I'd like to start off just with your journey. You did your undergrad in India, and then you went abroad. You did your master's in the US at Boston University and your PhD in Stanford, and then you chose to come back. I know a lot of other young professionals also do the same thing, but then they stay on in those countries. So could you speak more about your journey and what made you come back?
Actually, I came back twice. I came back after my master's and worked in India for 4 years. And then I went back for my PhD and did my PhD in postdoc and then came back. So I went through the back and forth twice. I mean, everybody's journey is unique, obviously. And in our particular case, we had, the reasons for moving back were primarily personal. We had both, multiple parents with cancer, and we just couldn't take care of them from living in the US. And so we decided to relocate. But I will say that I haven't regretted the decision, in the sense that it's been really exciting to work on challenging problems. So in fact, last week, one of my professors from Stanford was here, and that was his, he said, "Oh, I wish I could work on such challenging problems." In fact, I remember once when I presented in one of the US universities, somebody said, "Well, I wish I could work on the type of water problems that you have. And I said, well, why didn't I wish we could not have the water problems, like that you don't have. So in a sense, there's two sides to the coin, right? When you get to move back, you also work on problems that are really difficult, wicked problems. And intellectually, that's very rewarding. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great and very interesting to hear. I mean, that sort of leads to my next question, which is you kind of alluded to already, which is like, what are the differences you see like in the way that research happens abroad, like in like the West versus how research happens like in places like India or like Africa, Asia, everywhere?
Yeah, I think ironically, if you look at the best research that's done in India and Africa, unfortunately, it's done by people from outside India and Africa. And that's kind of a little bit disappointing. It has always been a little bit disappointing to me, because I think that there's a tendency for a lot of the mainstream academia in India to kind of do the very conventional, they kind of look at what was really cool and cutting edge in some of the top Western journals, and then they kind of try to there's kind of a playing catch up there, rather than let's kind of look at the problems outside our window and kind of see how do we kind of understand and demystify those. So I think the big difference that I see between India and the US is I feel India has more interesting problems, interesting from the point of view, it's just a more, it's a country that's undergoing a massive transformation, right? And so in a sense of watersheds are transforming, cities are transforming, access is transforming, new institutions are being formed, and we're kind of in the middle of all of that. And this is true of much of the developing world, Africa as well. While in a lot of the West, kind of a lot of the water systems have stabilized, and of course, climate change is a huge threat in the West, but it's a threat that kind of comes to the fore primarily because everything else is kind of stabilized. You're not seeing rapid urbanization, rapid population growth, rapid industrialization. None of that's happening. While in India, we call, I like to use the term everything change, because everything is changing simultaneously. And so climate change is, of course, going to hit us badly, but it's going to be an additional stressor over everything else that's happening. So I think the first thing that I would say is different between the Indian and Western context is really the extent to which, the nature of the problem itself is different. The second thing, of course, you're working while the problem is simultaneously more complex, you have much less data that's available, much less historical data, in general, data sparseness. But I would say the third piece of it is, it's really surprising to me as an Indian professional how little the data is analyzed. So I know that I would like to say that India is data abundant and data scarce at the same time, which you again don't see in the West. The West, you see a lot of data richness, but there's also many professionals who just played with the data. In India, I think there's a lot of data sets which are sitting there right in public view, which haven't been examined the way they should be. And so I feel just this morning, I was thinking, I wish I had 2 more hours every day that I could get up in the morning and just write this thing that I've been talking about, which is, data stories, which combine narratives and data. Because I know just sitting on my laptop, I have so much data that tells such interesting stories that I, for one, don't have enough time to tell, right? And so I think that this willingness to just play with the data and ask interesting questions, I'm not seeing enough of it in the Indian context. And I just wish young professionals and young students who are listening to this would ask interesting questions, and then go and look at the data and kind of say, what is the data telling me about this? So that's the third thing. And I think the last thing is, I think I would love to see more of this in India. I think that it's not enough in terms of just going out and doing field work. much of the US, you have long-term observatories, you have everywhere, where you have hydrology or sciences departments, you see a lot of willingness to go and install sensors, take measurements, kind of get hands and feet dirty. And I think that India still isn't quite there. It's getting there. You're beginning to see that change in your generation of students and young faculty. But I think the older generation is very much about models and remote sensing. And there's kind of a reinforcement because where data is sparse, instead of saying, let's go and test hypotheses, let's kind of do process understanding, let's get our hands and feet dirty and say, just there's so much of the description of the natural systems which is incomplete. So if you understand, like, how do mangroves behave, what happens to when rainforests get taken over by invasive species, what happens to the hydrology, what's the implication for dams and sedimentation. I mean, some of these entire sets of questions which just require good field-based work, that just is missing. And so I think I think that I think there's so much to be done. On one hand, it's an opportunity, but I do think that India is playing catch up. And then actually the last one is interdisciplinarity. I think that a lot of Indian universities, we don't have the big liberal arts universities, which have the science departments, the medical schools, the engineering schools, all sitting on one campus. So some of those conversations which happen serendipitously in US universities don't happen in India, because you have the Indian Institute of Science, the Indian Institute of Technology, and these are very, very kind of academically segregated. Again, this is changing because increasingly you're seeing a lot of the Indian Institutes of Technology at least starting humanities and social sciences departments and management schools and schools of public policy. And so that they're beginning to at least get more variation of voices on their campuses, which is then allowing the research to get a little more broader and interdisciplinary as those conversations begin to happen. But still a lot of the recruitment in the mainstream research institutions, because they are bound by government guidelines, there's still a little bit of, well, if you've got to work in this field, your undergraduate degree has to match the name of your department that you're applying to, that sort of thing. So a lot of the churn that you would want to see, where interesting conversations happen, where interesting questions get asked, where interesting cross-fertilization of ideas happens, some of that is only in the nascent stage in India, which I see much further ahead in a lot of Europe and the US and Australia. I mean, a lot of the Western developed world.
Right, interesting. So it seems like there's a lot of opportunity for young professionals to just take the data that already exists and analyze it, because no one's done it. Like in the West,
absolutely the case. We've been talking with some of the major funders in India who are very interested in holding hackathons. I'll tell you an example of where I see this. Literally in the last 2 years, nonprofits in India said, I'm sitting, and by the way, nonprofits in India, including myself, because even I'm sitting on this kind of data, have said, I'm sitting on 5 years of data and I'm feeling so guilty that I've done nothing with it. And they're just sitting on rich field data, in some cases 5 years of data, 8 years of data, cross-sectional data, panel data, and they're not, and primary data I'm talking about. And they've said, we're unable to we just don't have the bandwidth, because we work on a project time cycle. We collected all this data and then we had to move on to the next project. And because we're nonprofits, we don't have kind of the data professionals that are needed. So I really think, I've talked about this idea of research marketplaces before, and I really think India is a country which is really ripe for such a data research marketplace, where we can match kind of professionals and nonprofits to kind of bring out some of that. Sorry, I interrupted you when you were you were talking about yeah.
No, yeah, I was just, it's fine. I'm glad you followed up on that for sure. So I have, like, my next question is, so you are the director for the Center of Science for Social and Environmental Innovation. So we have a lot of innovative young professionals on this call today. So, and also I imagine you're thinking about innovation all the time. So what advice would you give to a smart, driven, inspired, rising young professional or graduate who's trying to do innovative things in their own country?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We started the center, 2.5 years ago, because we started with the idea that we were doing all of this research and the research was going nowhere. And when you work for a private, independent research institution, there's a lot of question about, why are you doing this research and what impact is it having? How did it change the world and so on? So one of the reasons that we switched from what had been a very, interesting and exciting research career, but I made I think a fairly sharp right turn to move towards the space of innovation, is because we realized that there was no point if I was always looking backwards and looking at what had already happened and trying to understand that better, that wasn't leading necessarily to better solutions. And so what I realized is that deeper understanding has to feed back into intervention design and solutioning. And that feedback loop just wasn't existing. So that was the reason we started kind of the center. Now, we use the word innovation because we realized that a lot of the solutions kind of exist and sometimes exist because, but they just don't, you have to build the ecosystem around them. By which I mean, for example, we've known how to do wastewater treatment for 250 years, but even the sewers of rich cities like Bangalore, which have one of the highest per capita incomes in India, are full of sewage. And so I think that one of the issues is how do you solve the problem if the problem is really not that the solution doesn't exist, but that the pieces and the actors that need to work together to make the solution work aren't working together. So one form of innovation is what we call ecosystem building, which is systemic innovation. How do we get all the pieces to fit together? The other kind of innovation, which is, I imagine what you're talking a little bit more about, which is about just, new technologies, dashboards, sensors, that sort of stuff. And I think that's a very important central part of what can be transformative in these new, and particularly in places like India, where a lot of the new systems are being built. I think it can be very transformative. What I would say though, as a young professional is in the sense of, I think what's really missing perhaps is a lot of the young professionals that we talk to have a great idea. They're basically like, we would like to do this. We think this is a great idea. And sometimes I've served on these panels for a few of these young companies. An hour into the conversation, they'd be asking you, well, how should we price this product and so on and so forth. And I'd ask them, well, what are your user surveys showing you? And it would become very apparent that they actually haven't spoken to their potential users of it. So I think that the most important thing I would ask young professionals is, if you have an innovation, have you spoken to the people that you think are going to that it's going to help, or that are going to use your product or technology or service or whatever, or data? Because I think the most important thing is to first listen and to be very as user driven as we possibly can. And then I think once we get into the habit of listening, a lot of the pain points of our users becomes very, very clear. And then it becomes clear kind of what the solution has to do. And I know what I'm saying sounds very obvious, but I see a startling number of startups in the water and agriculture sector that haven't spoken to their potential users. So I thought I should mention that.
Great, thanks. I think Linesha is really relating to a lot of stuff you're saying, and she even had a question on the chat. Linesha, would you just like to ask it?
Sure, no problem. So we're very much in the same space in terms of untapping a lot of potential data. We have mountains of data, and it's about refining it and finding the right key players to create that solution that you talked about, Veena. So my question was, and you sort of answered this, but maybe to provide a very clear answer or very direct answer, how do you suggest we consider finding the right partnerships and collaborations so that we can tap into this data fields and these data potentials and find those solutions?
So I think that, I mean, obviously it's not going to be a one size fit one size fits all answer, because I think data ownership, of course, is going to vary, across sectors, across rural and urban, across private and nonprofit, across government and corporate, all of that. It's going to, that does matter about who owns the data. But I think the particular example, I'll start with the easiest example that I referred to earlier, which was the nonprofit sector, because that's kind of often a case where you're starting with a group of people who kind of have a lot of data, but are inherently kind of public spirited, if you want to call them that, and inherently want to make the data, often, not always, but often want to make the data public. And so that's where I was kind of suggesting the idea of hackathons and marketplaces, data marketplaces, to see whether you can kind of match users of data and suppliers of data through something like that, and whether you could do this consistently, or this had to be a one-time thing. And the idea we'd been pursuing is, how do I bring kind of a little bit of philanthropic funding into, and then bring nonprofits, bring students and the money together, so that the students kind of are able to work with pieces of, sections of the data, and they are able to kind of co-publish with the nonprofit the nonprofit organizations that generated the data, but the funding basically sweetens the deal. So that was kind of the specific format of what we had recommended. Now, obviously, this is a very specific case, but there's a lot of organizations in India that are working with government data. And one of the challenges, but it's navigated a little differently. I'll give you an example of one nonprofit which does this, I think, relatively well, is the Foundation for Ecological Security in India. It's a nonprofit organization, and they run something called the India Observatory. Now, India Observatory is interesting because it's primarily populated with large government data sets, and the India Observatory has signed contractual agreements with government agencies, but then they have they're not allowed to share the data publicly they're not allowed to share the data on. But what they are allowed to do is they're allowed to build tools on those data sets and allow people to use those tools. So they'll have tools like, how do you, if you're a nonprofit and you want to figure out where do you cite recharge structures, they'll give you access to all the available data sets. You won't be able to download the data itself, but you'll be able to download the map saying what are the potential sites where you can locate your data. And so often they act as if you want to call it, an intermediary between the owner of the data, which happens to be government, where the data is not publicly available, but potential users of the data, which can be in the private or nonprofit or government sectors, who might want to access that data, but it's behind, it's not publicly available, but they act as an intermediary to allow that data to become partially available. So that's kind of a different model. Then there are other kinds of models with the corporate sector, for example, where one of the struggles is a lot of the corporate sector collects a lot of data for purposes of reporting how their performance on net water positivity, or the GRI reporting indices, where they have to report on sustainability. Countries like India actually have made this kind of reporting mandatory. Now, one of the big frustrations we've had there is that the data is obviously being collected. The data itself are not made public. So they're not openly available. And often once you look through the reports, you kind of don't get enough granularity to actually make any use of that data. And so I think what is needed is really a push, a more kind of an activist push, in terms of how do you push for changes in these standards themselves, whether it's through something like a CEO water mandate, or a global water partnership or something, to kind of say, well, there are best practices in reporting, and for the data to be useful, so that whether it's useful for benchmarking, useful to hold corporates more accountable, so that they're not blue washing, but they're actually making the kinds of changes that we want in the directions they want. And so I think each of those examples of how do you interact with data, kind of, I gave you 3 different examples. I think they require 3 different approaches. Linesh, did that answer your question?
Yes, nice. All right, I'm gonna go to some more classic mentor questions. Have you had a mentor? Like, what are some good mentor experiences you've had in your career?
Yeah, I've had a few great mentors that I'm very, very grateful to have had. I think my earliest mentor kind of in water, when I actually switched from energy, I used to be in the energy sector a long time ago. When I switched from energy to water was actually Peter Glick from Pacific Institute, kind of gave me my first break into the water sector. Um, I think obviously all of my mentors at Stanford were great, but one of my postdoctoral mentors who helped me in kind of my early career was Professor Sivapalan, who is a well-known socio-hydrologist. And I think one of the big opportunities that Professor Sivapalan gave me very early in my career was opportunities for leadership. And I think that was pretty important because and I'm going to say this particularly as a woman. All of my early career was it was in India in the 1990s. And I think for a lot of my career, there's been kind of this tendency of, what's a good way to kind of put it? But for a lot of people to not see women as leaders, they kind of, you're really smart and you're really a good ego beaver, but really we would like you to be my secretary type of thing. And I think that's been kind of a repeated theme for many, many, many decades in my career. And so I think Professor Sivapalan really stands out for breaking that pattern and basically giving me leadership opportunities. And I think I really value that. It was incredible what I got the opportunity to do with being a section editor in a journal early on, being allowed to lead the Pandarai network early on, being allowed to lead the social hydrology community early on. All of these were incredible opportunities, and they made a big difference formatively.
Yeah, that's great. Like, mentors are a good stepping stone to providing you opportunities, right? Like, how did you even approach these mentors? Did they reach out to you? You must have reached out.
I'm pretty sure I just walked up to him at a conference and said, I read your paper and this is the work I did. And I consider myself a social hydrologist. I've been looking at bidirectional feedbacks for a long time. And at the time when I approached him, I got my PhD in 2008 and his paper came out in 2011. My paper was essentially did a lot of what later, my PhD work was essentially a lot of what social hydrology did later, which is agent-based modeling. Of course, we didn't use the term social hydrology, but it was agent-based modeling. It was, bidirectional feedbacks, coevolution, a lot of these ideas that later became popular with social hydrology. Except when I graduated, I couldn't get a job. I mean, literally no one would hire me because no one in India would hire me. No one in the US would hire me. Nobody anywhere in the world wanted to hire me because they were like, this is just too weird. We don't understand what it is. It's like, are you a hydrologist? Are you an economist? Are you a social scientist? I couldn't fit in anybody's box. And I realized, again, over my career, unfortunately, I'm not the kind of person who fits in boxes. And now I've just kind of learned to embrace it. But at that time, it was frightening to see. And so my going up to him and saying, I don't seem to fit anywhere. And then him looking at my work and said, I really like this. And here, would you like to lead this and that? And initially, to give Professor Sivapalan, he gives a lot of young people opportunities. But he also he gives you opportunities to work. Not opportunity. It's not a prize that you're getting. It's not, somebody's not giving you a piece of chocolate and saying it's a reward. What they're saying is, here's an opportunity for you to prove yourself. And I think the best thing that you can ask for and the best thing I can do for young people is to give opportunities for people to shine. Then they shine and then, their career gets built and then they grow from there.
Great. That's just awesome to hear. We had a bunch of audience questions that came in even before we even started this whole session. So Billy, would you like to ask some of those?
Yeah, actually, so Tim asked a question in the chat earlier in the conversation. So Tim, if you're still around, would you like to ask your question in person?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Hey, everybody. I think you already kind of mentioned this, but in kind of the difference between the Indian water crisis, I think was mentioned kind of your introduction, and in comparing that to kind of the U.S., especially in the Western U.S., what we consider the water crisis. But any other comparisons, differences? I'm sure there are many that you could expand on. I was just kind of curious about that.
Between India and the US in terms of the water problems itself?
Exactly. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of I don't think there are any watersheds in India that are pristine watersheds. And so I think, the US has a lot of long-term observatories where, where they have 20, 25, 30 years of data, and where you can characterize the watersheds themselves. I think that entire concept doesn't exist in India because every square kilometer seems to have human human signatures. And so I think that in India, I would say that if you're a hydrologist, everybody's a social hydrologist. There's no such thing as a hydrologist, is the way I would argue. You should look at Indian hydrology, which I don't think is quite true in the US. I think in the US, you can actually, in a river basin, you can still find large sections of it which are relatively untouched, where you can kind of understand fundamental processes. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, I still think, and this is not about I'm not sure if your question was about the differences between Indian science and US science, or Indian watersheds and US watersheds. It was the latter, right? Indian watersheds and US watersheds.
Yeah. The latter.
Yeah, I think I would say that's the primary difference. And then it's just, I think like I said, on one hand, the anthropogenic signatures, on the other hand, just how much more urgent the problems are, in the sense of, if you make a mistake, a lot of people suffer. And I think those are the two primary differences, I would say.
Great, thank you. And so I guess the next question that I saw was from Arpita. Arpita, are you still on the call? Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I'm here. Very good to see and hear you, Veena. You speak so well. And you rightly said, you don't fit in boxes. You're very unique. More power to you on that. Keep going. My question is, why is the number of field hydrologists in India so little? And what really are the challenges? Of course, you touched upon this briefly, and this question was posed even before the talk. So if you could just elaborate, from your experiences, some of the challenges in this role.
Yeah, I think the hardest piece of field hydrology, I mean, I think that, I mean, maybe you should answer the question more than me. I think that I don't work for a mainstream institution. I think one challenge that a lot of traditional institutions have is with the way government funding is set up, and how much money you can get for equipment and so on. I think a second problem I would still say is culture. For some reason, we don't have for some reason we pride, it's kind of like the difference in physics, where you have the theoretical physicists looking down at the experimental physicists. I think that kind of carries over into water research, except I think that it's absurd, because sometimes the theory goes into almost, like, people are willing to do really esoteric stuff. So I don't know if any of you have seen any of my cartoons on this, but I have a cartoon where, there's a journalist interviewing a professor who says, and asking, what do you think about the drought in your city? And the professor says, I don't work on hydrological problems in my city. I only download USGS data sets. Now, the reason I did that cartoon was that was a true story. When I started doing my research many years ago, I talked to one of the local faculty and I asked, well, why aren't you working? The city is kind of really suffering, and what do you think needs to be done in terms of hydrological modeling and so on? And he said, I don't work on Indian data sets. I only work on USGS data sets, because what was considered prestigious was, and that was what was considered publishable, was to work on good quality data sets, which didn't have interruption, where you could apply very sophisticated, mathematically sophisticated models. And so unfortunately, when you're doing a lot of field hydrology, squirrels will eat the cables. I mean, snakes you'll never have perfect data. There's theft and there's vandalism. You have to walk in trudgy, through these muddy fields and install it, only to have like the local kids throw it away. It's challenging. And after all of that time and effort and money and spent in the hot sun, you may or may not get a publishable paper. So I myself am guilty. I mean, the amount of data I have far, far, far exceeds anything I've published, because we have data which is will not quite make the bar of a publication. So I'll tell you a good example. I ran a participatory groundwater monitoring program for years. Okay, and we did everything. We ran cameras down the bore wells. We trained the farmers. We ran a water literacy program. We got the farmers to measure their own groundwater levels every month for like 4 years. We set up weather stations, all of this stuff. But the data that we got after all of that effort is insightful. Actually, there's really cool insights from it, but it's not enough to make a GRL paper by itself. And I was just thinking this morning, saying that or GRL or WRR or any prestigious paper, while maybe if I had spent the same 4 years, mucking at the edges of some algorithm, I might have got a paper in something or the other. And that people would have said, okay, that's cool. So I think one of the reasons is you've got to put a lot more work before you can get something worthwhile. And maybe a lot of people just don't have the time, money, energy. They can't fit into their teaching schedule. So I'm being kind of very candid that it's harder. But personally, I've reached the point in my career now where I don't need those publications and whatever anymore. And one of the things I've been thinking is I should do, so maybe you can ask me in a year, Arpita, if I've done it, is to just put out these data stories, to kind of say, I've got these nice, interesting data sets. I don't care about the GRL publication anymore. Why don't I just put it out as snippets as a Water by Numbers blog series, so that at least somebody else can use it, or at least it gets into people's mindsets. So I think, it's a very long answer to your very nice question is, field hydrology is hard. It takes money and it's not as rewarding. I wish more people would do it nonetheless.
Great. And our next question is from Yash. So Yash, are you still on the line? I posted your question in the chat. I'll give them another couple seconds.
Hello, ma'am.
Mhm.
Hello.
Yep. Hi, Yash.
Hello, ma'am. I'm a mechanical engineering undergrad currently, but I think I'm very interested in the water restoration projects or regenerative projects, but I don't really have any experience related to the same. I wanted to know what could be opportunities in India related to education, maybe, through which I can enter into the sector after a mechanical engineering graduation degree. So that was one of the things. And secondly, how can I get to know exactly where I want to be in the projects? Like, I don't know if I want to work exactly in the water sector or other parts in the natural resources sector. So how can I get a better idea, and what are the options in India for studying further?
Yeah, I think the best way to
Thank you.
Is my voice breaking up or is it clear?
It's clear on my end.
Okay. I think the best way, Yash, is to get your hands dirty is the easiest way I would suggest it. So I think that firstly, mechanical engineering is incredibly valuable to any kind of restoration project. A lot of it, if you just wanted, even if you just wanted to stay on the mechanical side, a lot of actual restoration involves things like dredging and removal of hyacinth and, a lot of stuff, which I'm sure mechanical engineering background would be of value. The way I would start is to try and, after you've graduated from your degree, try and go to some of the major well-known nonprofits or government, either agencies. Harder to do government because government sometimes has a more traditional entry process, but on the consultancy side, you can definitely get in, where there is a lot of restoration work going on. So whether it's the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund India, WRI, ATRI, all of these organizations, CEW, CSE, I mean, all of these organizations do work in different parts of the restoration spectrum. So I would consider kind of getting my hands messy for a couple of years on one of those projects and learning what is there to be learned. And then in terms of, I would always suggest do a degree after you kind of felt out which part of the spectrum you're finding enjoyable. And then after that, I think there's, in terms of master's programs, there's a lot of emerging master's programs in the country. Terry University is of course well known. But in terms of APU, ATRI itself has a master's program. There's a number of master's programs in the country, apart from the more traditional IITs and ISERs and so on, which offer kind of spaces to do this. Now, personally, and there's also something in India called the India Youth Water Network, which perhaps is not as active as one, but at least it's a nice way to get to meet other water professionals. So that's another thing to look at. And then I think once you've kind of got a degree, I think the best way to do it is to kind of, like I said, even while you're studying, if you're able to pick research internship sites in the summer, pick your project sites so that you're actually working on some of these restoration programs. I think very quickly you'll kind of get a lay of the land and figure out which piece of it interests you the most.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. And one of the things I wanted to ask, just prior to me asking this question, you said that the entrepreneurs or the new innovators need to ask questions to the people they are developing the product for. So that was a very important point, of course. But I was just thinking about, like, now disasters may be developing, or there will be more frequency in disasters that come. So if I am thinking of some innovative product in terms of disasters, suppose, like, I don't have exact idea, but I'm just thinking, if I want to develop a product related to disaster management, but suppose I take Assam floods, how can I take the survey or reach out to the people of Assam itself as to what thing do you need the product for, or what sort of product do you need currently? If I want to do something,
Well, I think
even in case of
that's true. We don't expect you to swim there during a flood and ask people, right? But I think even if you go, two things, I think you can still go and talk to people about their experiences. So firstly, most important, you don't go and ever ask people what do you want. Because if people knew with clarity what they want, then they would most probably have already figured it out. So innovation is, when I'm saying talk to people, I don't mean asking them what do you want, but really understanding their experiences so you can surface what is called pain points, right? So there's a lot of design thinking courses that you can take to kind of say, what's a structured process I can use to uncover these pain points without asking people, what are you struggling with? So that's one. You can always go after the flood and kind of listen to people's experiences and ask curious questions like, why wasn't it possible for you to do that? What was stopping you from going there? What would you have wanted to happen at that point? And then obviously talk to lots of people, and then a pattern emerges from those conversations. which is then what you're leading to an innovation. And then once you prototyped it, the other group of people that you would talk to are faster responders who actually work in flood affected communities, whether it's the Red Cross, the Good Samaritans, the disaster management cells of different. You can also talk to the Army, what's it called, public defense. All of these basically who respond during types of natural disasters. They are also people to validate your hypotheses. So it doesn't have to be that I have to go and swim in the flood, while people are drowning. But both of these, are groups of people to validate.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to know a bit about, like, is there any chance I can get an internship or something, opportunities in Atri, like in the December or winter intern opportunities?
Sure, I'm just posting a couple of email addresses, but you can just write there and we'll figure that out.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, great. So we're almost at the end of our session. I have one last question. If you could just answer it in a minute or so, and then we'll wrap it up. Like, if you could give one bit of advice to everyone, all the young professionals on this call today, what do you want them to hear?
I think that follow your own path is, I think one of the things that people, and especially that you guys are young, I think don't be afraid to fail. I think one of the biggest problems that all of us kind of struggle with, we're kind of our own worst critics, and we put so much of weight on failing that we don't try. And the only way you can innovate and be a good innovator is if you're not afraid to try. So I would say, if you want to be an innovator, then you have to be ready to fail and not feel miserable about it. Pick yourself up and keep going.
Okay, great. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. Sandy, do you have any last things you'd like to say, or should we just wrap it up?
No, thank you so much, Veena. That was a really, really special episode. So many great insights to take away from there. And as always, we just really love to hear from you guys. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, also, if you have any suggestions for speakers you'd like to see on our next mentor episode series, please feel free, reach out, get in touch. We love to hear from you guys. I just dropped the survey link there in the chat. And thank you again, everyone. Great audience, great speaker. It was great to see everyone, and looking forward to next time.
Great.